Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 28th of August, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mark Robinson. Joining me by video link today, Charles Mallett and Vanessa Beeley. Welcome to the programme, both. Now, we're going to get started with yesterday's, I'm not really sure how to describe it, in the park with Keir Starmer, who's apparently going to fix the foundations. But of course, in order to get to the foundations to fix them, you've got to demolish the building first. But let's listen to a little bit of what he had to say.
But I have to be honest with you, things are worse than we ever imagined. In the first few weeks, we discovered a £22 billion black hole in the public finances. And before anyone says, oh, this is just performative or playing politics, let's remember the OBR did not know about it. They wrote a letter setting that out. And they didn't know because the last government hid it. And even last Wednesday, just last Wednesday, we found out that thanks to the last government's recklessness, we borrowed almost £5 billion more than the OBR expected in the last 3 months alone. That's not performative, that's fact.
Depends on your definition of fact, but poor Keir, the naughty Tories have destroyed the economy, and he's going to have to deal with it. Never mind the fact that he basically agreed to everything that they did over the last since 2010 anyway, or at least he and his while he was in various shadow cabinet roles and as leader of the Labour Party and now as Prime Minister. So he made that comment, setting the scene for what came next. Let's have a listen.
But I will be honest with you, there is a budget coming in October, and it's going to be painful. We have no other choice, given the situation that we're in. Those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heavier burden.
So those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden, and many people would agree with that statement. They should bear the heaviest burden, but he didn't say they will. He didn't say they would. He absolutely said they should, and of course that's a very different thing. Now the question then is, what is the reason for this economic disaster that we're facing? Is it just the incompetence of the Tory party, or is there something else going on? Well, let's bring this on screen, this tweet. And it's Toby Young, and he's really echoing, or at least his commentator on his Daily Sceptic is echoing this, that, you know, in fact, the Tories left the economy worse than we imagined, is belied by strong growth figures and so on. But of course, this isn't really what Starmer was talking about. And the question is, why are we facing economic ruin despite what people might be doing in the broader economy? So let's bring Alex Craner on screen in a second. And he starts to ask some questions and join some dots. Let's have a listen to this first little clip.
It is clear that the UK has continued making all the mistakes made by other decaying empires, particularly in terms of foreign adventurism. A sudden deterioration which developed during the course of this year seems to be related to the imminent military defeat in West's proxy war against Russia. Britain has been the principal cheerleader and sponsor of that conflict, and she seems to have gone in over her head. In addition to providing at least £7.5 billion, nearly $10 billion in military aid, Britain gave another £5 billion, or $6.5 billion to Ukraine in financial support. Furthermore, Britain has also guaranteed multiple tranches of World Bank loans to Ukraine, and many British financial institutions have purchased billions worth of Ukraine's bonds.
Okay, so now we're starting to get some serious discussion going on here, because Alex Craner highlighting the amount of money that the UK has pushed in the direction of Ukraine in the form of loans, admittedly, in some cases. But the question is, are we ever going to see that money returned? We'll come on to that in a second, but also in grants as well, and never mind the amount of military material and so on that has been sent over that has to be replaced. That has to be funded as well. So Alex Craner goes on to talk about the likelihood of anybody receiving their money from Ukraine in the form of a repayment.
But Ukraine can't service her mounting foreign debts. On Sunday, May 4, the Wall Street Journal reported that a group of foreign bondholders, including such behemoths as BlackRock, PIMCO, and Francis Amundi, put pressure on the government of Ukraine to start repaying some of its debts. Back in July 2022, this group granted Kiev a 2-year grace period to pause repayments of some $20 billion in bonds they had previously purchased. That agreement was due to expire on August 1, 2024. Just the interest on those debts alone would amount to nearly $1.5 billion a year, which is actually triple what the media had reported. And here we're talking still only about $20 billion out of Ukraine's total debt of well over $160 billion. Given the catastrophic state of the country's finances, the repayment of these debts would collapse Ukraine's government and its economy.
Apparently, Britain isn't going to allow that to happen, but the question is Britain going to allow its own economy to collapse as a result? Let's continue with Alex Crinner.
What's peculiar about the British financial system is that the taxpayers are obliged to reimburse the Bank of England for any losses it sustains on its balance sheet assets. If the price of gilts on the bank's balance sheet collapses, British taxpayer must cover those losses and make the bank whole. So what kind of money are we talking about? As the Financial Times reported last July, the Bank of England estimated that it will require the Treasury to transfer a total of £150 billion by 2023 to cover the bank's expected losses on its quantitative easing program. And how much is £150 billion? Unless things have deteriorated since July 2023, and I think they have, we're talking £2,240 per man, woman and child in Britain. That's the ransom which the Bank of England is claiming from them.
And I think the use of the word ransom there is absolutely appropriate. We have one more clip from Alex Crinner continuing to talk about the Bank of England.
When businesses are losing sales to poverty rather than competition, we know that the parasite is killing the host. The parasite here is the banking cartel, and it doesn't care about the plight of the ordinary British people. In an interview last year, Bank of England's top economist Hugh Pill thought that the best advice he could offer to his fellow Britons was to just accept being worse off.
Just accept being worse off. Alex Crinner has put together a very good report on the reality of the situation, and that belies any claims that under the previous Tory regime, the economy in this country has been burgeoning. In fact, the government has been systematically destroying it, undermining it, and the Bank of England and the banking cartel. And so if we put Keir Starmer on screen here for a second, this is the key point. He supported everything the Tories did in Ukraine. He has created this problem in the UK, and the problem is not going to go away anytime soon. But he also supported the entire principle of levelling up. And as we've made the point before, we've got to look at levelling up in terms of a seesaw. So if certain countries in the world, as they like to present it, are going to be lifted in terms of standard of living, other countries in the world have to come down in standard of living. That is sustainability, and that is the direction that we're heading in. This country is going to see a reduction in standard of living, and Ukraine is part of the cause of that. But government policy generally is the main part of the cause of it. Okay, apologies for the technical issue there. That was my fault, a bit of a Biden moment. But let me welcome Vanessa to the programme. And let's come up to date with what's been going on in the Middle East and Hezbollah.
Yeah, well, certainly I'm just going to carry on from the short excerpt you showed on Monday from the Times of Israel that was claiming that Israel had preemptively struck the launch sites in Lebanon. And I will now prove that that was the Times of Israel fibbing. First of all, the US didn't, despite the 1/3 of their military being moved to the area, to the region. They only provided Israel with intelligence during Hezbollah's response. That's a comment from the Pentagon. And then regarding the claim from Israel that they preemptively struck thousands of targets for missile launches inside Lebanon, let's have a listen again to Alistair Crook, former diplomat and very knowledgeable on the region, talking about exactly that.
So Hezbollah was planning the operation to fire drones and rockets at 5:15 on Sunday morning. And Israel started to an attack, and a direct attack, and it involved, I think, about 100 aircraft. But contrary to what the Israeli propagandist at the IDF was saying, and I know this not from Hezbollah, but I know this from inside Lebanon, people who are on the ground there. It was a chaotic 20 minutes. Israel just bombed various valleys where they imagined the ballistic missiles were. But they'd been cleared out of there some time ago, and there were no ballistic missiles. You can check that. I mean, there are people on the ground who know what's happened. There are no missiles. So when it said they destroyed thousands of missile launchers, this is a complete lie.
I concur with Alistair Crook on that. And then, so basically, top US general who's currently visiting the northern occupied territory, so on the border with Lebanon, rather than going into Tel Aviv to speak about Gaza. So that's quite interesting. He's claiming, General Charles Brown, that Hezbollah's response, despite it only being supposedly the first part of the retaliation, reduced the risk of regional war, but he warns that, of course, we're still waiting for the retaliation from the other members of the resistance axis, including the most important, Iran. So then let's have a look at a little video that was put together showing what Hezbollah actually hit inside Israel. And it's interesting that Israel is not putting any statements out at all. There's a complete blackout about the actual damage caused by Hezbollah's attack. So, I mean, quite an impressive first stage of the retaliation. Then let's have a look at what Israeli media is also trying to present as the problems with the Hezbollah attack. So if we have a look at the headline from the Jerusalem Post, the IDF is claiming that 90% of Hezbollah's rockets fired from civilian areas. And of course, that's a claim that you'll often hear about Hamas in Gaza. But let's have a look at a later image actually published by the IOF themselves, which shows quite clearly the red blobs there are the targeted missile launchers. And I think you can see quite clearly, even from the IOF evidence, that they are pretty far away from any civilian areas, comparing to, of course, the Israeli military bases embedded in the center of Tel Aviv amidst civilian areas. So then what's also been happening in Gaza in the last 4 days, 170 have been killed, and what has been really an increase, if it's possible, of the genocidal campaign, 390 injured, more schools targeted, more journalists killed. And the majority of the Gazan civilians are now basically being pushed onto a coastal area, which has reduced the area of safety considerably. As you can see, probably 2 million Gazans are going to be crammed into this area between the land and the sea. And then let's have a look at what they face. So they have tanks from behind them, boats from the sea firing on them. And this is just one clip of what happened during the day. I mean, obviously that plane was only firing flares, but of course what it's demonstrating is that at any time these tent cities on the beach can be bombed and there is absolutely nowhere for them to go. Shin Bet chief warns settler violence doing indescribable damage to Israel. Ronan Bar wrote to Netanyahu warning that Security Minister Ben-Gvir's actions in Al-Aqsa could lead to bloodshed. We've been talking about this schism between the far-right extremist factions and really the return to the Irgun terrorist gangs under the control of the far-right. And then I just wanted to show this example of these far-right gangs to the south of Hebron, demonstrating Shia terrorism against Palestinian farmers and landowners.
Hey, someone touches him, my cows.
Okay. Why your cows came here?
Why cows? Because this is my land.
But this is my
I
house.
was given it by God and Abraham
Shame,
and Isaac, Yaakov.
shame. Hey,
Shut
no,
the fuck up.
this is my house.
It's not your house.
This is okay. That's your house. Okay, you.
Tell your crazy witch to go to fuck to the house. Let's go.
Where?
Let's go right now. Show
What
your
you
phone.
want?
No, I want to dance with you, man.
Dance with
I
me?
want to dance with you. You look,
I'm not your bitch.
you look sweet. You are my bitch. And you look sweet, you know? You look so fresh, so sweet. I would be happy to sit with you in a jail someday. I would be happy. You know שדה תימן? שדה תימן? אונס לשם שמיים, מה שנאמר. אתה מבין? מה אני מדבר?
I don't know. I mean, I personally find that video deeply disturbing. Teman, of course, is the prison where the soldiers were accused of raping a Palestinian prisoner.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much for that, Vanessa. Charles, let's come to you and the latest on biosecurity and bird flu, perhaps.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, all. Yes, I start with a slide on bird flu, not to suggest that there is a sort of present threat or that there's anything being suggested quite at this minute by the government, but nonetheless, they are putting out guidance, and particularly the text suggesting that we have zero bird flu. You'll remember during the confected COVID pandemic that New Zealand in particular pursued what was called a sort of strategy of zero COVID. And I was just really asking the question as to whether the UK might be doing the same thing with bird flu. They say that they've self-declared zonal freedom from highly pathogenic avian influenza, and that this is in line with the World Organization for Animal Health. So we'll just have a look at them. You'll see a tweet on the left with a statement on the recent surge. It's being called a surge in Mpox virus, which is the abbreviated word for monkeypox with a silent K occasionally. But on the right, they say that they've had a century of improving animal health and welfare. I would say that's a highly questionable statement. But specifically here, they say Mpox is a zoonotic virus that can spread from animals to humans, posing risks to both human and animal health. They have not robust scientific evidence to back that statement up, but nonetheless, it hangs out there. I should also point out that the Bill and Melinda Gates have in their pocket the World Organization for Animal Health, like a lot of other organizations. If the text's too small, then this shows that there have been annual grants, well, more or less annual grants made to the organization for in the region of $1.5 million a throw. And then also we come on to the Gavi Alliance, with which Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Bill Gates specifically is heavily involved. And they've given a statement on the Mpox emergency in Africa, in which they state that they're deeply concerned about the escalating emergency on the African continent. And they talk about welcoming the recently announced measures by our partners at the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Africa CDC, and the World Health Organization, WHO. Now, we've talked about the private funding of the WHO by Bill Gates, and it's no great surprise, therefore, to see that the Africa CDC has as a partner the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as well as the American CDC and, of course, Chatham House. This is just listed alphabetically. It's just interesting to see those three lined up side by side. So really what we have here is not necessarily the requirement for a pandemic as such to be put out in order to control, but we only really need the spectre of a pandemic, or the spectre of the idea that communicable disease can move not just between animals, but from animals to humans. And the government here are starting to put out much more messaging on this. First of all, we've got Farmers Weekly complaining about airtime that Brian May, the Queen guitarist, has been given to talk about whether or not badgers communicate TB to cattle. But of course, the main thrust of the debate is that TB spreads from creature to creature, whether that be badger to cattle or cattle to cattle or even deer. But the idea is that we are never allowed to consider the living conditions or the environment of the cattle. We are forced into believing that this is done by method of spread in the form of communicable disease. We've then got sort of a newer one, really, which is Peste des Petits Ruminants, PPR, and that's being targeted to, well, sort of at sheep and goats. And then we've got Blue Tongue, which I spoke about earlier in the year, and we had the sort of slightly ludicrous weather forecasting prognosis that midges were being blown across the channel, subject to wind conditions. Of course, there's no account taken of the terribly damp weather and in fact, whether there was any evidence for midges to be involved in the first place. And then we've got African swine fever. Now, as I say, the interesting thing here is not just to consider the animals, but really the humans. So the biosecurity stage is what I'm titling this, because they talk about making records of movements, not just of live pigs, but dead stock and people, including staff. And this is going to be requested by APHA, the Animal Plant and Health Agency. And this basically all comes from the updated Health and Welfare Privacy Notice, recently updated just last week, within which there is a lot of text about data being collected for, all sorts of uses. But they say data used by APHA is usually obtained directly from the data subjects, which would be us. Occasionally, though, where necessary under the relevant animal health and welfare legislation, and for disease surveillance and control, data is referred from other bodies working closely with APHA. They give a couple of examples, but of course that really could mean anyone that they choose. They go on to say that they use the data to safeguard animal and health welfare. Well, of course, by suggesting that these communicable diseases can pass from animal to animal and on to humans, they say that they'd be protecting human health where relevant, brackets, zoonoses. And further, they go on to say, uphold and comply with animal health and welfare legislation. So, of course, this is all backed by legislation, effectively strong-arming people into a situation where they have very little room for manoeuvre. I've entitled this misinformation because they go on to make the rather ludicrous claim that they will not allow any unwarranted breach of confidentiality and will not act in contravention of our obligations, their obligations, they mean, under UK data protection legislation. Well, there's absolutely no way they can guarantee that there's not going to be a breach of confidentiality. This has been a theme that we've discussed many, many times on UK Column. But nonetheless, this should be seen as not just an intelligence gathering exercise, but one of surveillance and control that's being dressed up to look like concern for animal welfare, which of course it isn't. And this moves us on to the measures that are coming in Scotland at the beginning of September, and then in England and Wales in October, which is to enforce everybody to register all birds that they keep. And as somebody called Cat Lives Matter said on Twitter, who is going to police it? Good luck, which is probably a pithy and to the mark comment to make. But this is the registration of all birds. Previously, the limit was 50. That's now going down to 1. And the point to make here is this is absolutely in flagrant disregard of the consultation that was conducted, which the overwhelming majority, 75% of respondents, of which there were a large number, said that the measures absolutely did not need to be changed. So, of course, this is the direction that we're going in. And I would argue that this is a form of intimidation. They're saying here that you must register by the 1st of October. This is England and Wales. As I say, September for Scotland. This includes any birds you keep as pets, and you're breaking the law if you do not register. So with terrorism in mind, and something I've spoken about increasingly recently, which is that the government really are falling into the definition of terrorism by attempting to intimidate a section of the population for ideological or political ends. But just to close off here, they're talking about the contact and update if there's an outbreak in your area, and that you'll help prevent the spread of disease and protect all kept birds. So effectively just leaving you with a taste in your mouth that actually you should be looking at your neighbours, very much exactly the same playbook from the COVID era, considering sneaking on those around you, and altogether creating a sense of surveillance, control, monitoring, and indeed the sense of fear.
Yes, thank you, Charles. Thank you for that. Okay, if you like what the UK Column does, you'd like to support us, support.ukcolumn.org is the place to go. £5 a month is a membership, and that makes a massive difference to us. So please do join us if you possibly can. If you'd like to share material from the various platforms, ukcolumn.org, ukcolumnextracts.co.uk is the place to go for that. Please help overcome the algorithms. We're still kicked off Facebook, I think, as Vanessa is as well. And you can pick something up at the UK Column shop. Lots of items there, and that helps too. And especially Your Life in Their Hands. There's still copies of this available. Now, tomorrow at 1 p.m, Charles and I will be speaking to Bob Moran. We're delighted to say this is pre-recorded, of course, but it premiered at 1 p.m. tomorrow. Join us for that if you possibly can. That was a fascinating conversation and well worth joining us. The interview that Charles did with Joel Salatin is up on the website at the moment. That's called Let the Animals Do the Work. We'll talk a little bit more about this in extra, no doubt. Some names for the 19th of October. So aside from us at the UK Column team, Piers Robinson, David Miller, Peter Ford, Bob Moran, Ahmed Malik, Katie Jo Murphin, Claire Wills Harrison, otherwise known, well, at least contributes to the Lawyers for Light Telegram channel and so on. These will all be there on the day. A couple more names to be announced in the coming days. That's going to be a very interesting event, so please get to it if you possibly can. And on September the 8th, from 6 to 10 p.m, we're hosting a symposium on behalf of International Centre for 9/11 Justice on aviation impossibilities. So this is as close to the anniversary of 9/11 as we can get. This is going to be looking at deconstructing the official story of the 9/11 hijackings and the air defence failures. Reminder that Brian and I will be speaking at the Heritage Party Conference on the 20th of September. Details at heritageparty.org, and there are tickets available for that. And finally, another reminder of the Died Suddenly exhibition, which is being hosted by Jake Fern, and his email address is on screen at the moment if you would like more details. The exact location to be determined. That's in November. So let's come back onto the censorship issue again and bring Pavel Durov on screen once again. And let's just give a quick update on this. The French authorities were apparently embarrassed about the amount of furore this caused, and so they released a press release. We'll show you that in a second, but this is basically what it said. They are accusing of being complicit in storing and distributing child sexual abuse material, facilitating drug trafficking, facilitating organized fraud and other illegal transactions. Their main complaint, or one of their main complaints, seems to be that Telegram refuses to cooperate with law enforcement when they file formal requests for information or documents. They say that Telegram's cryptographic features haven't been formally certified by the French authorities, and this is something that, of course, recent legislation requires platforms to do in the UK as well. They've got to explain to the government the nature of their cryptographic features, and if they're going to add new features, they've got to ask for permission from the government to create those. Has taken part is the next allegation in a, quotes, criminal association with a view to commit a crime or offence punishable by 5 or more years of imprisonment, as well as money laundering. So this was a bit of information that I hadn't appreciated, that he holds French citizenship, which is possibly why he is experiencing this problem at the moment. But the other issue is that Telegram, as we mentioned on Monday's program, is mostly unencrypted. And so the French authorities are trying to say, well, you know, most of the content on Telegram is in clear text. Therefore, there's no reason for you not to comply with our request for information. And of course, this he's effectively created this problem for himself by choosing the architecture that he has. Now, we'll explain why he's chosen that architecture in a second. So they are saying that Telegram is in a position to give the French government what they ask for, but Telegram has been refusing to do that on principle. All other platforms comply with the limit, to the limit imposed by their architecture. So whenever other platforms, like even Signal, receive a request from governments around the world for information, they give that information. But because they are fully end-to-end encrypted, of course, there's an extreme limit to what they can actually give, but they can still comply with the demands. The reason that Telegram does things the way that they do is that their architecture supports communications with huge groups. This is why Telegram is used by campaign organizations and people that are organizing various protests and so on. This is the advantage of it. So this is the actual press release. We'll have the link to that in the show notes. If you read French, you can see the full details. And I just remind everybody that, you know, with respect to end-to-end encryption itself, the National Crime Agency in the UK, as well as the European police chiefs, continue to be extremely concerned about it. So while they're busy arresting people because they have a platform which doesn't, by default, impose end-to-end encryption, they are complaining about everybody else doing the same. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago, of course, that the UK column and Vanessa and others apparently kicked off Facebook at the moment. Well, Zuckerberg was making a comment to Congress in a letter a day or two ago, where he said this: before the internet, anonymous communication. Sorry, that is not the correct quote. Well, basically, he was saying that that the US government had effectively asked him to censor certain COVID-19 content, and that he regretted that. Now, this is completely hypocritical because, as we have recently discovered, they are continuing to censor various platforms, including ourselves, So, you know, his complaints about the U.S. government attempting to impose censorship regimes is really hypocritical. But we'll talk a bit more about that on Friday. Charles, let's come back to you and policing in the UK.
Come under a great deal of scrutiny over the last few weeks for very obvious reasons. There's been some chatter about the effect, I suppose, that either this or other factors have had on police figures in particular. So I thought we'd just go back and have a look at the updated statistics now from the police workforce document last updated in July of this year. And really the main thing to draw your attention to there with the red arrow on the right is that the number of people joining police has dipped significantly over the past year. And of course, this is significant because the next graph shows that the number of people leaving police has remained very high. So just a few more points to draw out of that, which is that the overall rate of leaving is just over 6%. The voluntary resignation rate is at 3.5%, which is a record high. 43% of people leaving have had less than 5 years of service in police, which is significant. And they say that 90.4% are in frontline roles. Now, I would just make a clarification there that frontline does include, or rather, I think that gives people the impression that those are police on the streets in uniform. That is absolutely not the case. Frontline includes an awful lot of desk-bound roles that are within the overall capacity of police to investigate. So, for example, the staffing of a custody block, or indeed a CID or sexual offences team or something like that would still be considered frontline, but they are certainly not going to be out on the streets unless there is an absolute crisis. 4.8 decrease in local policing, again significant. But of course, here we go, two record highs here, 35.5% female and 8.4% ethnic minority. They describe as being record high figures. But what I want to come on to is the 4% long-term absent, which again is a very high number. And so the question is really, what sort of person are we recruiting into police now, or at least are hanging around for any great degree of time? I've got a short video just to ask that question a little bit further as to the type of person that we should expect to be policed by.
This is your warning. If it continues, you will be arrested. One more time, that's
I'm going to do it. Hey? You might as well, come on then.
One more time.
Go on, arrest me. Hey? Arrest me. Go on.
2023, select this lane with the red. Oh, yeah.
Arrested for tooting your horn.
Right, you're arrested for 64 in from the corner.
Now, that might seem like a rather silly example of modern day policing, and it might not have been audible, but essentially that policeman had told the lady with the horn that if she did it again, she would be arrested. And of course, she did it again, and she was indeed arrested. Now, that's ludicrous for several reasons, not least because either the threshold for an arrest has been met or it hasn't. So this is not, you can't excuse this by just saying that he's exercising discretion. Further, on a noise level, I mean, the reason you couldn't hear any speech is because there was somebody using a chainsaw in the background. To suggest that a small plastic horn could in some way be sort of overpowering a chainsaw is, of course, ludicrous. But specifically, he arrested her under Section 4A of the Public Order Act 1986, which is to cause harassment, alarm and anxiety with intent. So we will just look at the specific text from the CPS website explaining how this works. And they say that it's important to prove that the defendant's intent is not enough. So first of all, was the lady with the horn actually trying to call harassment, alarm or distress? There must also be evidence of somebody, which might not be the person targeted, suffering actual harassment, alarm or distress as a result. And they go on to say this evidence could come from that person themselves, or it could come from another witness who can say that the person displayed signs of harassment, alarm or distress. As the effect on the victim is an essential element of the offence, prosecutors should not presume that it had the effect, but should seek evidence which is capable of proving it. Now, I don't want to overanalyze a 30-second clip of a ridiculous incident on the internet, but it does speak volumes that policeman quite clearly was assuming himself to be the victim of such intent. So first of all, was the intent there? And really, as somebody that deals with this stuff day in, day out, why on earth would something like that be considered an offence? How could that possibly be the case? So we've got that at one end of the spectrum. And then, of course, we go further on and we look at the other sorts of things that are being brought out at the minute. The Home Office just announcing that there's now, it's not really an amnesty. I would say that this is actually an intelligence gathering exercise. They are changing the law around what are called zombie knives, which are effectively 8-inch blades with sort of ancillary bits on them, and essentially horrid bits of kit, machetes as well, And what they're saying is that these things can be handed in from between the 26th of August and the 23rd of September. But of course, in order to do that and to receive compensation, you have to fill in forms. Therefore, you are in effect identifying and incriminating yourself if you choose that path. So that's one thing to look at. The other thing I just want to have a very quick look at is a video from Enfield last night.
Was so right. So right. Was so right. They killed him. Call the police. Call the police. Give me my phone. Give me my phone. Give me my phone. Let me call the police. He's dead. He's running. He's running. Call the police. Call the police. Call the police. Call the police. I need to record it. Cool. He ran out. What have you done? Call the police.
Now, there are two reasons for showing that. First of all, one is to illustrate the sense of lawlessness. If you couldn't see that clip, and it was indistinct, but there were gunshots being fired on a residential street late at night, being filmed by a member of the public. Now, the issue with the filming of the member of the public is that at times during her commentary, she said things that were factually inaccurate, such as, he's dead. Now, the reason I highlight that is that under the provisions of the Online Safety Act 2023, we've seen that people who put these things out on social media can become targets of this legislation. And the way in which it's being manipulated is absolutely reprehensible. So this is just something to be aware of. And I spoke a couple of weeks ago about David Clues of the UNN Unity News Network, who I have recorded a conversation with, and I will put that out and give further details in due course. But really, it's a quick sort of snapshot summary of some of the dire sort of situations within which police are becoming embroiled and involved at the moment.
Charles, thank you. Vanessa, let's come back to you now. And what's the situation in the United States with respect to the Middle East?
Oh, well, we've got the Trump Dream Team, which I'm going to show details on right now. So we're all saved. The world is saved. So let's first of all set the scene with Trump's campaign video, or one of them, that he posted on X a couple of days ago. So let's roll this.
Before thousands were brutally killed, including Americans. Before Iran helped Hamas plan the attack, killing Americans. Before Biden gave billions of taxpayers' money to Iran, Trump played hardball with Iran, destroyed ISIS, kept the Middle East at peace, kept us out of endless wars through strength.
History shows very plainly that evil only respects one thing: unyielding strength. When I'm back in the White House, our enemies will know if you spill a drop of American blood, we will spill a gallon of yours.
President Trump, the strength we need to make America strong again.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
That's the message of peace from Donald Trump. So let's just run through a little bit of the Dream Team. So Trump, we know, never had a better friend. That was Trump speaking about Israel on numerous occasions, but this was just one recorded instance where he tells Israel they never had a better friend. Then, a lot is being made of the fact that Trump didn't start any wars. But let's just clarify a few points on this. So this is just taken, I think this was in 2019, where Trump actually flip-flopped after saying that he'd never wanted to assassinate Syria's President Assad, which was reported in journalist Bob Woodward's 2018 book, Fear. He actually went on Fox News and said that the US should effing kill Assad following the alleged fabricated 27 chemical attack in Khan Yunis in Syria. And also remembering, Trump introduced the Caesar Act, collective punishment sanctions in Syria. He stole the oil. He burned agricultural crops. He funded and enabled ISIS, despite claiming to be fighting it just as every other president. He pulverized Raqqa and Mosul in Iraq, so he doesn't start any wars, remember this. He gave 17 billion to NATO, including security assistance funding to Ukraine. He increased the numbers of US military in Europe prior to, of course, the Russian special military operation, because I tend to see all of these candidates as tag teams. We'll talk about this in extra. He increased the drone program and decreased accountability for the drone program by 432% from President Obama. So those are just, some of the factors that say to me that Trump is not anti-war, despite the fact he didn't start any. He certainly didn't end any. And in my opinion, he paved the way for what we're seeing now, the genocide in Palestine. So anyway, let's come on to Robert F. Kennedy, who suspends his campaign to back Trump. And let's see a little sort of cameo video that Kennedy put out showing why he did that.
To end this calamity, the chronic disease crisis was one of the primary reasons for my running for president, along with ending censorship in the Ukraine war. It's the reason I've made the heart-wrenching decision to suspend my campaign and to support President Trump. That's it.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I would love to freeze frame that an extra and have a look at that handshake because it looks extremely dodgy to me. But anyway, Kennedy's slogan is make America healthy again, save the children. But apparently he's only there to save American children while he denies the genocide of Palestinian children by the Zionist entity. And here, of course, he's being absolutely iconized by Rabbi Shmuley, one of the most honestly repellent representatives of the Zionist movement in the US, talking about one of Kennedy's videos in defense of Israel. Of course, he's made many, and we've showcased many of those on UK Column News. But then let's have a look at what Kennedy tweeted out in the last couple of days. Wonder Woman just joined the Justice League. So now this unholy alliance with Trump and his little followers is being called the Justice League by Robert Kennedy, and who's joined them? Tulsi Gabbard. Let's have a look at Tulsi. I think it was about 2 months after the genocide began, or rather continued from 1948, but that's another issue. And let's see what she was saying about the March for Israel.
I got to tell you, there's a very loud absence, though, in knowing that President Biden and Vice President Harris are literally just down the street as people are traveling here from all over the country, yet they don't feel it's important enough to come and stand with our fellow Americans to send this strong and resounding message at a time when anti-Semitic attacks around the world are at their height, that we will not allow it to continue, that we stand with Israel and the Jewish people. They are a reminder of why I left the Democratic Party. It's a party that's become led by and rife with Islamist apologists, people who are more afraid of being called bigoted Islamophobes than they are about actually showing up for the Jewish people, for America, for peace and security and freedom.
One might ask for whose peace, security, and freedom. And of course, they're talking about ending censorship. And yet Trump has made it quite clear that he's going to quell the protests, the anti-genocide protests, and deport what he describes as pro-Hamas radicals. Of course, we've just had British journalist Richard Medhurst arrested under the Terrorist Act Section 12, which is basically the promotion of prescribed terrorist actors. The National Students for Justice in Palestine recently put out on X, the Hillel Foundation and the Secure Community Network just publicly launched their new campaign, Operation Secure Our Campuses. Operation Secure Our Campuses, does that remind you of anything? Does that remind you of some of the Israeli campaigns against the Palestinians? at over 50 campuses. In preparation, the SCN held a roundtable with representatives from law enforcement agencies, including the FBI, to generate a list of 10 security recommendations for universities to quell pro-Palestine protests in the fall. So remember, this is the party that is against censorship, obviously not against the censorship of those things that threaten Israel. Kennedy, during his presidential campaign, he asked the head of the Zionist Organization of America, one of the largest Zionist movement organizations, and its leader, Mort Klein, to be his advisor on Israel. AIPAC tracker on X, Donald Trump has so far received more than 1 million. Tulsi Gabbard, 39,950 from AIPAC. And then if we look at the funding of Miriam Adelson, again, embedded in the Zionist complex in the United States, will do whatever it takes to help Trump win with $100 million. On the left, you've got Tulsi Gabbard with Miriam Adelson and with Rabbi Shmuley. And if we look at the next two photos, you've got Robert Kennedy and his wife. I think it's his wife, or it's Rabbi Shmuley's wife, probably, actually. With Rabbi Shmuley and Trump putting a medal on Miriam Adelson for very obvious reasons. And when I say that American politics, uni-party politics, has become cartoon land, this is trending on X. So you've got Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, Trump, Kennedy, Elon Musk, all arch Zionist supporters. And in the background, you've got Vivek Ramaswamy, an American Indian descent biotech entrepreneur who also had his own presidential campaign until January, when he left that to endorse Trump. So you have team unity, which in my opinion is going to take us ever closer to global Armageddon.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Vanessa. Charles, let's come back to you and a terrible coincidence.
Yes, thanks, Mike. An extension of a segment from last week in which I spoke about the apparent but extremely unlikely coincidence between the deaths of then Stephen Chamberlain, formerly of Autonomy, and Mike Lynch of Autonomy, but subsequently involved with Darktrace. Now, in the interim, sadly, the news has emerged that Lynch, Bloomer and Morvillo, who were associated with the banking and legal side of the campaign in the trial that was concerning the sale of Autonomy to Hewlett-Packard and the suggestion that there'd been an inflation of the price. And I suggested last week there would be more to this story to come out. And indeed, that does very much seem to be the case, but most particularly to do with Darktrace, the AI cybersecurity company, because in actual fact, since April of this year, there's been an attempt to purchase that company, make a cash offer. Here we see from Thoma Bravo, an investment company. But again, as with these things, there's much more to it than meets the eye. We see here that it's announced by the Computing Channel that the offer is for 5.3 billion. The significant detail about this, of course, is that the cash acquisition equates to around £6.20 per share and a 44% premium on the company's average stock price over the past 3 months. It was listed on the London Stock Exchange at £2.50 per share in 2021. So we just see here the sort of legal and administrative side of it, and as part of this acquisition, effectively, it would be not via Thoma Bravo, but they would be creating a separate entity called Luke Bidco. And just to illustrate the complexity of the situation, and although this might be in effect above board and procedural, and certainly these entities, particularly Bidco and Midco, are part of this process, but nonetheless, what I've done here is drawn from Companies House to show that Luke Bidco is in fact controlled by Midco 3, which is controlled by Midco 2, which is controlled by Midco 1. And then underneath there, we see that there's the Lear Finco, also controlled by Luke Midco 3. Now, this is an extremely complicated web of, in effect, holding companies. And the reason I pointed out is that they all come under the sole directorship of this chap, Sasha May, who is a board member of SailPoint, Highland and Sophos. There isn't time to talk about those today, but they are all sort of inveigled in some way with some of the architecture of the security systems that we use in this country, and most particularly the NHS with Sophos. So it definitely is worth mentioning. The other side of this is that we see that FGS Global Works have been involved with the deal between Thoma Bravo and Darktrace. Now, that's significant because the global co-chair at FGS Global is none other than Roland Rudd, the brother of the former Home Secretary Amber Rudd. And we look back and we see that in 2020, Amber Rudd was appointed to Darktrace's advisory board. So it really is wheels within wheels. And what I want to do now is just show a brief clip of Mike Lynch, the now deceased former chief executive of Autonomy and Invoke Capital, talking about the use of technology as a strategic asset and whether the United Kingdom government should be considering as such in light of the situation in Russia and Ukraine.
The second thing, which is absolutely fascinating, is that things like connectivity have become weaponized. This is not about, a sort of war of attrition where people sort of pummeling tanks from each side. It's about cognition. And so the skill set and the approach to dealing with threats completely different. And when you follow that all back, you end up with the understanding that there are now strategic assets. And those strategic assets, if you don't have them, you are incredibly exposed. So I was just talking about connectivity, the ability on the Ukrainian battlefield to have independent connectivity, which is happening through satellite technology, is actually what's driving a lot of what's going on.
So we've spoken a lot of the effective sort of merge between corporations and defence, national or state defence entities. And that seems to be exactly what Lynch is talking about, which bears relation to the Starlink and the sort of space connection that I'd been talking about previously with regard to Elon Musk. Now, the other thing is just to have a look at how the value of Darktrace is rated by Fitch, the ratings agency. And we see here that they assign Darktrace as a B rating, which is just interesting in light of the 44% premium. B, they qualify as being highly speculative, and they say that material default risk is present and that it's vulnerable to deterioration in the business and economic environment. Mike last week spoke about the symbiotic relationship between cybersecurity and cybercrime and indeed the intelligence services, and I think it was a very good phrase to use. So here from that same piece from Fitch, we see that they say that there's a technology disruption risk. Darktrace operates in the cybersecurity space where threats and solutions are constantly evolving. Technology disruptions are inherent in the industry. Now, the reason I've highlighted threats and solutions is to pose the question, are they coming from the same place? And to what degree are the intelligence services involved in all of this? Well, to answer part of that question, we look at Poppy Gustafsson, the current chief executive, on the left here, shown at the Future of Britain conference, which of course Ben and Debbie have reported on both last year and this year, but that's Tony Blair's pony. And then we've got on the right the Founders Forum, showing absolutely in plain sight Chief Executive Poppy Gustafsson sitting down with the Director General of GCHQ and Keith Butler. So really the sort of the web that has been exposed by this extraordinarily coincidental, but as I say, I mean, really beyond the bounds of possibility that these deaths should be regarded as accidental, although of course that is speculation at this point. There's no evidence to support that, but the web that is being exposed by this is perfectly extraordinary, and it is something that we will have to continue to look at.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Charles. Now let's move on to continuing with AI, I suppose, in a sense, because the British government has pushed this out this morning, using AI tools to help reduce teacher workload. So we're going to educate our kids with more and more AI. They're very, very excited about this. They're saying that artificial intelligence will be better at helping teachers mark work and plan lessons under a new project announced by the UK government today. It's backed by £4 million. And these are going to provide curriculum guidance through AI, lesson plans through AI, anonymized pupil assessments through AI. and it will all be used by AI companies to train tools so they can generate accurate, high-quality content for those purposes. It comes as new research. Well, before we get to the new research, we'll just mention this because the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology was tweeting out this morning a poll asking if AI was able to ease the burden for them, what do you think would save teachers time? So there's no opportunity there to say that AI is a load of nonsense and shouldn't be going anywhere near the classroom. That's not an option. Help marking homework, create teaching materials, and help with admin are the three options in their poll. But anyway, this new research, which is from Thinks, Insight and Strategy, also from the Responsible Technology Adoption Unit of the UK Government and from the Department for Education, is called Responsible Technology Adoption Unit and Department of Education Research on Public Attitudes Towards the Use of AI in Education. So they are extremely excited about this. They're talking about £4 million here, £3 million there, in a partnership with the Open University, which is sharing learning resources. And it follows Department of Education tests, which show providing generative AI models with the kind of data that they're providing can increase accuracy to 92%, up from 67% when no targeted data was provided to a large language model. So, you know, this is about making sure that they provide the right narrative to the schools to be taught by the teachers. The teachers don't really have to think anymore. I think it's incredible. We'll talk about a little bit more about that in extra. We've got one final thing here, Charles.
Yeah, I just wanted to remind people really that today marks 30 years by date since the Sunday trading laws changed, or Sunday Trading Act came into effect on what was then Sunday, the 28th of August, 1994. If we just put that slide on screen to have a look at that. I've got a video to go into this in extra time, but also to consider, I'm not suggesting that it was only in 1994 that the rot set in, but it's worth noting that having looked at the church's supposedly ethical investment policies in recent years and find that they say that they don't want to have anything to do with pornography, weapons, and sort of things that are destructive to the environment, they're absolutely permitted to invest in them. And of course, back in 1994, one of the biggest shopping centres to open was the Metro Centre in Gateshead, which was financed by the Church of England.
Right, okay, thank you. We'll talk a bit more about that in extra as well. So join us for that if you're a UK Column member in a couple of minutes. Otherwise, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for Bob Moran, and we'll be back with the news on Friday at 1 p.m. as usual. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.